Thank you for joining us for today's Network Resilience Coalition webinar. I need to tell you that we're recording this webinar today as part of my intro here. I am Schwarz, coordinator of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. Today, we will hear from government and private sector speakers on the growing cyber threat arising from nation states that are targeting unsupported software and equipment and what can be done about it. Last month, when the Network Resilience Coalition put out its report, we discussed that we'd already seen threats from Russia and China and other countries looking for unpatched and unmitigated weaknesses in our critical infrastructure. Since then, the reports about Volt Typhoon, a campaign from the PRC specifically, to look for unsupported IT infrastructure in critical infrastructure. Today, we will go into more detail with specifics on Volt Typhoon and other similar threats. I will now hand things over to the Center's Deputy Coordinator, Bree Law, who will introduce our government speakers.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce Special Agent Jason Bilnoski. He's the Section Chief within the FBI's Cyber Division, serving as the Liaison Officer to the NSA's Cybersecurity Directorate and U.S. Cyber Command. In this role, he leads a diverse team focused on strategic collaboration, policy development, and whole-of-government response to significant cybersecurity matters impacting the United States. Among other distinguished assignments, in 2016, Mr. Bilnoski was transferred to the Detroit Field Office, where he became the supervisor for the Computer Intrusion Squad, responsible for criminal and national security computer intrusion investigations. In addition, Mr. Bilnoski supervised the investigative activities of the Detroit Field Office's Cyber Task Force. We're excited to have you with us today. Over to you.
Hey, thank you for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. The FBI, along with our domestic and international partners, and I see my CISA colleagues on the line here, we've been quite busy over the last few weeks and few months. So I understand Volt Typhoon is the topic of the day, but I would be remiss in my duties if I don't at least touch on ransomware very briefly, because it is still a crushing problem to our nation. So prevention and resiliency continue to be the key to success when it comes to ransomware. So the FBI and our domestic international partners are continuously seeking out opportunities to impose significant risk and consequences on those criminal actors. An example of that is just 3 weeks ago, the FBI, our domestic partners, our UK partners, and other international law enforcement partners announced the disruption of Lockbit, the ransomware group, which was one of the most active ransomware groups in the world. It had targeted over 2,000 victims. It received more than $120 million in ransomware payments, and it made ransomware demands totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. In this significant operation, criminal actors were indicted, arrested, infrastructure and funds were seized, but most importantly for the victims, hundreds of victims can now be assisted by the FBI and our partners based on the decryption tools that we developed throughout this operation. So again, ransomware is prevalent, it doesn't discriminate, and is still a significant problem for our nation. Equally concerning are our nation-state adversaries that continue to target our infrastructure throughout the United States and the world. The PRC, so the People's Republic of China, Russian security services, Iran, and North Korea continue their malicious activity. I think FBI Director Wray said it best when he described Russian state-sponsored activity as reckless and the PRC as relentless. So if you go back to circa 2016, 2017 with Russia activity with the NotPetya ransomware attack, although it wasn't a ransomware attack, it truly turned out to be just a malicious cyber attack. To this day, it continues to be the largest and most costly destructive cyber attack known worldwide. And the PRC continues their relentless efforts to target our infrastructure. So we're going to talk about that here briefly. In most cases, what we see from our investigative standpoint is these advanced persistent threat actors, they continue to exploit weak passwords, unpatched and end-of-life devices to gain access. In other words, it doesn't take a zero-day exploit to access systems. Why, if I'm an advanced actor, why am I going to use my holy grail of tools, expose it to the world when I can simply target weak infrastructure, unpatched systems? So we continue to see that as a vector for exploitation. So bottom line there is proper cyber hygiene and maintenance goes a long way in protecting infrastructure. So let me give you a few recent examples of what we've seen, both the FBI, CISA, and our partners over the last few months. So late December 23, the FBI and our partners attributed attacks on the U.S. water systems to IRGC affiliated actors. This was not some sophisticated hack. It was not a zero-day exploit that got the actors in the door. Rather, it was just specific compromised devices. So there was PLC controllers that were compromised by weak passwords. In other words, there was default passwords that were still in use. The simple fact is if those passwords would have been changed, it would have gone a long way to protecting those systems. Another example was late January of 2024. The FBI conducted a court-authorized operation which neutralized a network, hundreds of small office, home office routers that the Russian GRU, so Russian Security Services, also known as APT-28, and other forms called Fancy Bear. It was used to conceal and otherwise enable a variety of activities on behalf of the Russian security services. These crimes included spear phishing, credential harvesting, campaigns against targets of intelligence interest to the Russian government, and U.S. foreign infrastructure. So basically what happened here was the non-GRU actors, these cyber criminals, installed the MuBot malware on Edge OS routers. Again, unfortunately, these routers had default administrator passwords. GRU hackers then used this malware, the MuBot malware, to install their own scripts and files, repurpose the botnet, and it was off to the races for their espionage platform. So again, basic cyber hygiene could have prevented some of this exploitation. And then finally, it's been in the news enough recently, but we're going to continue to talk about it. The Volt Typhoon, the efforts by the People's Republic of China to target U.S. critical infrastructure and infrastructure around the world. So in December 2023, the FBI utilized a court-authorized operation and it disrupted hundreds of U.S.-based SOHO routers, which was hijacked by PRC actors. These hackers, known in the private sector as Volt Typhoon, they utilized the private routers, which was infected with the KV botnet, to conceal the origin of their hacking activities, which was directed against the U.S. and foreign victims. So the vast majority of these routers that were compromised by the KV botnet were simply routers that were out of date. It reached end-of-life status. So this operation deleted the botnet throughout these routers, and we took additional steps to sever the connection for the botnet, such as blocking communications with other devices used to control the botnet. But at the end of the day, I guess the examples that I'm trying to highlight here are best practices are still critical, and the priority still remains strong passwords combined with multi-factor authentication, patching and patch management, and we must address end-of-life devices in order to protect our infrastructure. There's a list that goes on, with that, but I would argue that if we pay attention to the basic cyber hygiene principles, we no longer become the lowest hanging fruit, right? And the actor has to either utilize more advanced techniques or they move on to a different victim. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Bree, and I appreciate the time today.
Thank you so much, Jason. We're now going to turn to Allan Friedman. Allan is a senior advisor and strategist at CISA. He coordinates the global cross-sector community efforts around software bill of materials, SBOM. He was previously the director of cybersecurity initiatives at NTIA, leading pioneering work on vulnerability disclosure, SBOM, and other security topics. Prior to joining the federal government, Friedman spent over a decade as a noted information security and technology policy scholar at Harvard's Computer Science Department, the Brookings Institution, and George Washington University's Engineering School. He has been a friend of the center and supportive of our projects, and we're thrilled to have him participate today. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Bree. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining this discussion today. Very excited first just to acknowledge some of what Jason said, which is just how closely various government agencies have been trying to work together on this. And one thing is that a lot of the work that I'll talk about in a moment is joint sealed between us at CISA and our friends and longtime partners at the Bureau. So thank you. Today, I want to touch a little bit on the threat, although hopefully folks are aware of this with the excellent testimony from Director Easterly and Director Ray. We'll talk a little bit about some of the great CISA activities that are going on in other parts of CISA around vulnerability management. But I also want to sort of zoom out to some of the big pictures of what is the path to resilience that hopefully the panel after this will take up. So first, hopefully there are very few people watching who just aren't aware of the scope of the threat especially coming from PRC. If or when China decides time has come to strike, they are not going to be focused purely on political or military targets. Infrastructure, and importantly, the glue that connects the infrastructure is going to be a key issue. So CISA teams have found and eradicated Chinese intrusions into critical infrastructure in many sectors: aviation, energy, water, telecommunications, especially. And what we found today is likely the tip of the iceberg. And we know that there's a focus from this actor in remaining stealthy, as Jason alluded to, and evading network defenses and intelligence capabilities. That's a priority. And one way they were doing that is by obfuscation networks of their operational infrastructure, right? The launching points for targeting our critical infrastructure. A key piece, and a lot of what we're talking about today, is the small office and home office, or SOHO routers, but more broadly, outdated tech. And we've seen similar patterns for other high-profile incidents against American critical infrastructure, including the attacks and the risks that we saw with the Colonial Pipeline a couple of years ago. It's also important to acknowledge that there is a little bit of shifting of this threat landscape, that we're talking about it differently now than we were just a few years ago. So, for example, many of you were involved in some work that came out just a few years ago. It's called the Botnet Report. It came out of some work from the Department of Commerce and other government agencies, including NTIA, where we looked at risks from IoT, from home routers. And at the time, it looked like, hey, you know what? There are lots of risks out there, but we should acknowledge that there are certain protections that are so built in right now, such as network address translation, or NAT. Today, we can't really rest on those assumptions, that a lot more systems are directly connected to the internet that weren't expressly designed for that kind of risk exposure. So briefly, as the threat evolves, what has CISA been doing? We've been identifying and evicting PRC cyber actors from American networks. We've identified and worked with compromised organizations, both very large ones and also small but very critical ones in important pieces of critical infrastructure. We're providing guidance and services to improve detection and prevention. So, for example, a recent report, PRC state-sponsored actors compromise and maintain persistent access to U.S. critical infrastructure, is based in part on recent CISA findings. And then lastly, what we're trying to do is drive some fundamental change in how technology products are designed and developed, so that threat actors can no longer saunter into what essentially amount to unlocked doors in critical infrastructure. And so I'll finish by sort of drilling into this idea of what does this path to resilience look like? How do we fundamentally change the lay of the land to change the calculus here and not make it quite so easy? Networking is, of course, a big part of this, and we're here to talk about the networking sector. But I also want to sort of underscore the importance of proposing both technical and policy solutions that can apply to as much of the critical infrastructure of this country as possible. And that includes everything from the national defense systems that use COTS technology to areas that affect the health and safety of all Americans, healthcare, water, energy, things like that. But of course, we know that the communication sector occupies a unique role as being the glue that connects everything together. So when we think about secure by design, right, this large effort driven across the administration, not just partners between CISA and the FBI, but with our international partners as well. The vision is risk mitigation at the outset, not putting users of technology at risk in the first place. And so we recently issued a Secure by Design update report on secure by design improvements specifically for SOHO router manufacturers. That is a joint effort that we put out with the FBI. And first of all, it just says, hey, listen, there are already a decent number of resources out there. Always want to acknowledge our friends out in Gaithersburg. There's been some excellent work for the NIST IoT core baseline that builds on a whole bunch of other work, including, hey, secure update. How do you make sure the update itself is secure? What you call a software update that isn't secured? You call it an RCE. And so we need to make sure that we're building that technology well from the start. And of course, NIST is also working on an IoT security profile explicitly for consumer grade routers. So let's go back and look at the principles of secure by design. I want to highlight 3 of the 5 that came out in the secure by design draft from last fall. Taking ownership of customer security outcomes, embracing radical transparency and accountability, and building organizational structure and leadership to achieve these goals. So the first one is ownership of customer security outcomes. And that means making automated and signed updates, automated and secure updates, table stakes for all the technology that we're going to be using. Second is making sure that the web management interface, right, the tools that often are used to pivot and direct change activity should be protected. They should be designed securely, ideally in LAN side ports, rather than things that we assume the customer is only going to access back out through the internet and then back into the local network. And then, of course, we always emphasize the secure by design. We never talk quite enough about secure by default. And a lot of what we need to do is make sure that changing secure defaults requires manual overrides, and that we make it clear even to the layperson what that means. Right? People setting up a network have a priority. They want to get the job done. We understand, but we need to make it as easy as possible to stay secure rather than deviate from that path. Second, we want to embrace radical transparency and accountability. This sounds a little scary, but we're already seeing this across the ecosystem today. First is vulnerability disclosure. Went from being a controversial and hot topic to now being just an expected part of being a software manufacturer. And this is an area where we think large manufacturers can work with smaller organizations to continue to climb, to continue that journey. Making sure that as vulnerabilities are found, we can track them and manage them. And that means giving them an identifier, giving them a CVE, so that it can be slotted into all tools that are out there. Automation is key for scaling security. And then lastly, just because I'm not allowed to give a talk without saying SBOM, maintaining SBOMs for visibility upstream, right? As organizations build software on top of software on top of software, we need to make sure that we can track those risks downstream and keep that visibility going. So last, I just want to touch on the importance of understanding and having better technology and policy for end of life and end of support software. This issue was identified in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the importance to identify and mitigate the risk of unsupported software that is widely used and that supports critical infrastructure. And this in turn was placed into the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan. For those of you who like to track chapter and verse, 3.3.2, which focuses on advancing SBOM and mitigating the risk of unsupported software that we're taking the lead on here at CISA. This is a huge problem. And in fact, on Friday, the great tech journalist Christopher Mims over at the Washington Journal put a public number on it. He said it's a $1.5 trillion problem, right? This isn't something that we're going to be easily able to buy our way out of. And we're not going to be able to get everything new. The solution can't just be rip and replace. So what can we do to advance our way towards a better position for networking technology and all software? Well, there are a couple of starting points. One is better and more clear definitions of what end of support means in the security perspective, and to be able to harmonize those across sectors and understand what that means in the open source world, what it means in regulated sectors, what it means in the marketing lingo that we all see in trade show expo floors, and make sure that we have a way of talking about it in a shared fashion. Second is machine readability, better metadata. There's some wonderful work that's happening in OASIS that hopefully Omar will talk about later on the panel to sort of translate this. There are other efforts out there as well. One of the things that we need to do in the government is make sure that we can harmonize this and really just focus on automation and build things into these tools. Third step is predictable location of this data. How do we make sure that people who need to know whether something is end of life or not can find that information? There isn't going to be a single way to do this. The one thing we've learned in the security space is that automation and modern IT technology doesn't lend itself to centralization. And so we need to find a way to make sure the data is available and if necessarily have redundant locations, but still not just rely on some centralized model. And then the last piece, and then we'll turn things over to hear from the real experts, is have a vision of building this into our tools and policies. In 2024, we cannot plan anything around cybersecurity that doesn't explicitly say we're going to automate as much as possible. And so starting to fold this into our tools and reaching out to the tooling community that organizations both large and small depend on is going to be key for thinking about the end of life and end of support. So summing up, there's a lot of work happening to staunch the bleeding by experts across the US government and across the private sector. And as we look forward, it behooves us to say, how do we make sure that this is a problem that won't be quite as dire in 2 or 3 years? Because we'll have more problems then. I'm not worried about that part. So let's make sure that we can automate as much of this as possible in the near future. So Bree, thank you so much for having me for this panel, for the conversation. I'm really looking forward to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allan, for joining us. That was really insightful. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Stephen Banghart, who is a cybersecurity services project manager on our team and has been spearheading the Network Resilience Coalition work for the center.
Thanks, Bree. And thank you so much to Jason and Allan for the great talks. A lot of really interesting topics that I'm going to hope that we can get to during this panel. So I'd like to start by going down our list of panelists and giving them a moment to introduce themselves. I'm going to let go in alphabetical order here by company. So if we could start by our panelist from BT, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon for me. I'm Christian Schwarz. I hail from British Telecoms in London. So I work in an area that's called network services, which covers fixed, mobile and broadband and also private cloud. Obviously we are providing a lot of components to the UK's critical national infrastructure, including the emergency service network and the emergency hotlines here. So they are 999s. Not the 911 here. And so this keeps us busy, and Volt Typhoon is definitely also on our radar. So happy to talk about this a bit more later on.
Thanks, Christian. Omar?
Excellent. Thank you for having me. My name is Omar Santos. I am from Cisco's Security and Trust organization. And that's the organization that has the incident response teams, both the CSIRT and the PSIRT team, so the Product Security Incident Response team as well. Our SDL program, our Insider Threat program, an offensive security research organization, and our threat intelligence as well. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Omar. And Derek.
Yep, I'm Derek Scholl, based in California. I have a much more narrow focus than Omar. I have the Product Security Incident Response team, so the PSIRT, the folks that write the security advisories for our products.
Great. Okay, so there are a lot of topics to cover here, but just kind of starting from some of the things that Jason mentioned in terms of dealing with nation state level threats, dealing with the advanced persistent threats, whether they're strictly affiliated with a nation state or if they're loosely affiliated with a nation state. As the people responsible for part of the security and incident handling at your organizations, do you find that preparing for or dealing with these nation state threats differ from dealing with a non-nation state threat? Is it more challenging? Is it less predictable? Or maybe it's not different at all? So we can start with Christian and hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I think there are a couple of differences. I mean, the first one is keep in mind that for example, for us as a telecoms operator, we need to provide connectivity, and we are essentially there a sitting duck waiting for being scanned, being seen, and to some degree being attacked as well. And obviously there's a stark difference between somebody who is more or less a script kiddie who has limited means, limited time and well, budget in order to attack a company such as BT versus a nation state that potentially is unlimited funding, time, and also effort and size to go into this. So the threats become exponentially bigger from a nation state actor or affiliated actor as well, than they are from a small organization or from a private person that just plays around a little bit. So definitely there is a big difference for us.
Omar?
Yeah, we at Cisco definitely recognize the challenge that we're facing in the threat landscape, moving forward. And of course, we have to protect against all threats. I mean, we don't have to differ, but what we do is we try to either leverage our own capability for zero trust, for incident response, threat intelligence capabilities to truly understand what is the landscape, and especially taking advantage of our team at Talos to see even not the attacks that we're seeing today, but what are they progress into the future, especially whenever it comes to things like artificial intelligence and so on. As a matter of fact, my role changed significantly in the last year or so, as you can imagine, of trying to see how we can protect not only the company, but the implementations that we have around artificial intelligence, and specifically how other organizations, threat actors are actually using this technology, right? And again, for us, I want to truly underscore what Allan and Jason mentioned, but specifically Allan was talking about automation. And you're going to see that repeating a lot. Is you might think, okay, automation is easy, it's not easy, right? But that's how we have to actually move forward, whether it's to increase our capabilities for secure by design, incident response, and any other cybersecurity operations within the organization. Thank you.
Derek?
Yeah. So the obvious answer is the level of sophistication, but it's been pointed out that a lot of these attacks aren't as sophisticated as you might think. It's simple password reuse and whatnot. But I think the real difference comes in the fact that they're playing the long game. That any intruder on your network is a bad thing. An intruder on your network who's going to be there for 3, 4, 5 years and be gathering things and finding the most effective way to launch an attack, I think is more nation state activity than the simple smash and grab or get what you can. So that's where I see the difference.
And that's a good segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the prevalence of so-called living off the land techniques that we saw with Volt Typhoon and that we see with other nation state actors as well. And when I say living off the land, I mean attackers that gain entry into a network or a system, and then they stay in the system using a small toolkit and then taking advantage of the things and vulnerabilities they find on the system to slowly grow their influence. And as Derek mentioned, this is very much in line with the long game approach of getting fingers in many pieces of a given system. So I'd love to hear from our panelists about what kind of challenges that kind of long game, that living off the land approach adds to your job of protecting your systems, as opposed to something that's a more simple, automated, smash and grab, scan for vulnerability and done. So Christian, do you have any thoughts on the challenges of living off the land attackers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been observing this for a while now, and we're working very closely with the CISA pendant in the UK, which is the NCSC, National Cybersecurity Center. And I think there is this public-private sector collaboration that is really starting to show the value of it. There's a lot of public advisories and stuff like this, which outline some of the information around what they use for leveling of the land and also what are the countermeasures. But to go more to your point and to your question is really, so one of the biggest differences in the traditional way, an attacker would use gain entry and then potentially download a piece of malware, and then this malware would connect back to a command and control or something like this. And from there, they scale it up and try to do it as scalable as possible. With the living of the land, they would use often tools that are native to the platform, as you mentioned. So scripts and tools and stuff like this that are native to the Linux platforms or Windows platforms that are running on our custom operating systems as well. And so it's much harder to detect because for the reaching out, you find that there is a new file. Well, this looks suspicious. You can find signatures, stuff like this. It's quote unquote fairly easy to spot once you think you have been hacked from a forensic point of view to find a malware piece or a file or something like this. With living off the land, the modifications are much smaller. They might be registry entries. They might be tools that are slightly modified, renamed, or just used in creative ways in order to gain foothold and go lateral then to other devices and part of the system. And this is also where you see the difference between a nation state that plays the long game, who would have the time and puts the effort in living for the living of the land, versus somebody who just wants to have a little bit of fun, as you say, smash and grab. And they would really rarely look into living off the land, which takes time, sophistication, and really good understanding. So there's big differences for us. And then from the detection point of view, this also means that we need to change the tools and the insights that we're having. So in the CISA advisories, there are some really helpful things already in there. The tooling gets better, but we also, I mean, just picking up of what mentioned earlier, we can leverage AI in order to help us and define footprints or find footprints of living off the land techniques, for example, where we see what is a normal profile, what is a normal behavior of a device or a cluster of devices versus what is new. And with these being able to distinguish between normal and abnormal patterns, we're already one step into, hey, let's do an analysis on this more profoundly, forensic and stuff like this, and we get on the track of those attackers.
Makes sense. Omar?
Yes, sir. Not to be repetitive, but one of the things that is very challenging for any organization is that even if you're adopting the best practices, and I know that we're talking about a lot of low-hanging fruit, and specifically around even network infrastructure that needs to be addressed. But even sometimes whenever you're adopting some of the best practices, distinguishing that between that malicious activity on living off the land and what is actually normal behavior is challenging. And it's because in many cases, organizations are operating in silos, right? Different IT teams, they have their own operational workflows and so on. Chris did a good job on highlighting a really, really good set of guidelines and best practices that CISA and many organizations, many government agencies actually have put together that are recent. So if you don't know what we're talking about, we definitely can make those available in the future. But one of the things that is highlighted in that guidance is the maintaining logging configurations that are appropriate. And if you think about this, you go back in time 20, 50 years ago, the best practice was just maintaining appropriate logging and capabilities. I don't know if I've been blessed or cursed, but I've been part of a lot of our incident response activities in the past. And every time, I'm talking about every time that we look or we ask consumers, customers and so on, can you help identify these appropriate logs for network infrastructure? And I can speak for the network infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's non-existent, right? And you will think, okay, this is the crown jewels of the organization, right? So, and I want to highlight one more thing before I pass it to Derek, is that in the past we have concentrated that living off the land is only the PSXX Windows or some library or binary in Linux. But in network infrastructure devices, there's a lot of additional living off the land show commands, a lot of things that you can actually do to manipulate a system, and or at least to gather information about a system, right? And in many of those cases, we need to make sure that we are putting the correct baselines in places, the correct logging capabilities in places, and the correct operational workflows in places to be able to detect and react against those attacks.
Derek?
Yeah. For me, the challenge has been brought home rather recently by some embarrassing issues that we had with a web-based GUI for administrating our devices, a tool that we offer to make it easier to do things that no big sophisticated user is going to expose to the internet. BT isn't using this to administer their devices. Joe's Donut Shop is. And when I publish an advisory warning people of a vulnerability in it, BT pays attention to those advisories and Joe's Donut Shop doesn't. And when I work with CISA and I get it put on the known exploited vulnerability list, and try and widen the circle, Joe's Donut Shop is still not fixing this low-end firewall that we sold them 10 years ago that has exposed this GUI to the internet. And again, someone is on it playing the long game. And the sophisticated actors aren't concerned or excited to have owned Joe's Donut Shop. But when Mike from Montana Power and Water, uses the same login and password on his Joe's Donut Shop login as he does on his corporate one, that's where you've sort of connected the dots. And, we're now a cog in a sophisticated, time-based, living off the land type of attack. And finding a way to get the Joe's Donut Shops of the world to realize the role that they play in this chain of events is something we continue to struggle with. And that's where I think things like this coalition, trying to broaden the reach, the expanse, the understanding that BT doesn't need to be told this stuff's important. They get that. But Joe's Donut Shop doesn't realize the part that they play.
Yeah, and I think that connects with a lot of what both Jason and Allan were talking about with regards to, it's the Soho devices in smaller places that are not getting the attention that perhaps they need. So in that context, thinking about these devices, thinking about dealing with living off the land techniques, the Network Resilience Coalition white paper talks a lot about outdated devices, out of support devices, and that clearly has a connection here when we're talking about living off the land. So I'd like to ask for our panelists at your organization and in your opinion, how can we help address the problem of living off the land by improving our updating, patching, vulnerability detection, communication, right? So as Derek mentioned, the very large organizations and the mainline devices are often well supported, well taken care of, but there's many small devices on the fringe or small organizations with devices that are outdated. Do you see a way to address that issue? Or if not, how are you trying to address living off the land now? Christian, if you want to get started.
Happy to go first again, but yeah, I'll
go the other way next time.
No, it's all good. I think we've got two classes of entry points, if I dare say, to our network. But there are more, but two big ones. The first one is the home routers that are with small businesses or end users, something like this, that you call Soho, and that are actually in a quote unquote hostile environment. And actually, we've got a couple of interesting things there. The first one is the UK government issued a couple of legislation recently called PSTI, Product Security and Telecom Infrastructure Bill, which will actually force anybody who's selling devices to end customers in the UK from the 29th of April to have a clear vulnerability disclosure for methodology, needs to indicate also how long the support will be, including security patching. and also make sure that there are no internet-facing unique credentials or generic credentials, and rather you need to have unique credentials. And this is already a big step up for many of the IoT devices that are in circulation within the UK. This is something that we've been doing for a while, but it's really good to see also the government raise the bar to, I mean, slightly, but just to a level that is improving the security hygiene for many, many companies and products already. So what we are doing there, to come to your point, Stephen, we have both a nice solution and a big problem. The solution to managing those devices is really patching on a regular basis. And I think we're doing a good job, and we have always had, for any devices that we are supporting, we provide regular patches, ongoing patches, and also critical patches if need be, out of cycle. And so the hygiene of those is actually quite good. The problem we are facing is that we want to replace those devices on a regular basis because we cannot support them forever. So we give them typically a lifetime of, let's say, 5 years, and say that, hey, after 5 years, you need to hand this back. And in the past, those devices were essentially sold. And so we tell the customer, hey, you're still subscribed to us. So here's the new one, shiny, many new features. Take this one. It's ultra secure. What they do is they sell it on eBay and keep the old one. So very bluntly, we had to go to a rental model where those devices are rented out, and we have a legal way of getting them back. I mean, it doesn't work in 100% of the cases, but in the majority of cases. So this is really for the end customer devices, small business, stuff like this. And the other part, the entry point is gateway devices, where we provide VPN, SSL VPN capability, stuff like this, with solutions from Cisco, Juniper, and others. And we're working very closely with them, because I strongly believe nobody wins if we're competing on security. We need to collaborate there, and we need to get away from a supplier-purchaser relationship to a partnership. And I think the NRC, so our Network Resilience Coalition, can be a major stepping stone in this regard, and really help us build more an ecosystem with both policy and the technical strength in order to improve this for everybody. So this is where we see really the biggest effort.
I love that. I love that note about customers taking the updated devices and selling them. It's this kind of disappointing reminder that reality makes security difficult sometimes, just the mundane things. Omar?
Yeah, I think that I want to truly underscore what Chris mentioned about nobody wins doing this by themselves. Collectively, I'm so blessed to be here, with Derek and Chris from BT, and we need more of these, right? Absolutely, we need more coordination, more awareness, right? The examples that we were giving, whether it's people selling on eBay and so on, I'm seeing in pretty much every incident nowadays that involves a network infrastructure device, a common denominator, of course, end of support, end of life is one of them. The second one is that the message from a PCERT team, including my own PCERT team, probably is not getting to those entities. They don't even have the capabilities or even awareness that these notifications actually exist, perhaps in other priorities, or they're actually using somebody else's to manage their network, right? And so it's out of their control. In many cases, some of these devices, I'm not talking about 5 years old or 10 years old. I'll give you the perfect example that we talked about a few months ago, Jaguar Tooth, right? That was an 18-year-old piece of software, 18, right? I wasn't even born by the time, right? But joke aside, these are some things that absolutely we have to provide some type of a migration path of not only the replacement of the device, but what are the operational culture, type of activities, and that's actually hard, easier said than done, right? I mean, it's a lot of efforts. But the things that we can do from our side is try to increase that automation. That instead of actually a human reading an advisory, and that's very close to my heart, that machines are actually doing this, right? And specifically what Allan was actually mentioning around automation, software transparency, and so on. We have to continue to evolve how devices are getting patched, the ease to upgrade, which I can also point fingers to Cisco in many cases, the definitely transparency is number one, and working together that information is actually getting to the right systems, to the right approach, not expecting that humans will be the one that actually going to be reading these. How can we actually automate and modernize the practices that we have in place? Thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, this one's really, really hard. We end of life a device. My team thinks we're done. We can shake our hands of this and walk away from it. We've got customers out there that are using them. They still work. We have customers that, have built something that they've sold on top of this, and they're still profiting from it. We have customers begging for us to extend service just a little bit longer, and sales is seeing dollar figures for it, so they do it. And the security geeks in the corner are shaking their hands and saying, no, 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 but everyone else is saying it still works. We're getting money from it. Keep doing it. Short of a, mission impossible, this device will self-destruct in 5 years kind of thing. How do you find the balance between we're still making profit from this and the security folks are terrified from it? I mean, this is one of the really, really big deals to try and figure out. And I don't have an answer yet.
Yeah. And I mean, I think part of the reason that everyone here, both participating and watching, we're here because it's a hard problem and we don't know the answer yet. And we're here to work towards that.
And Stephen, I think we didn't answer one part of your question about the communication. I think from an awareness point of view, it starts to change. I mean, both with the end customer who read more and more about data breaches. The issue there is they believe that it's an enterprise or company issue, and they are not part of the fault chain. This is something that we probably need to change because they are an entry vector. And for the time being, they read about data breaches in all of the companies. I mean, ransomware was mentioned earlier as well, but data breaches in particular as well. And this is associated with bad company behavior, not with bad personal behavior. But everybody should contribute in there. And so we try to change this with awareness campaigns as well with our end customers, and in particular with our businesses, obviously, with our business customers. But within the company, it's starting to change quite a bit as well. But there's the three-leg stool between delivery, service, and uptime availability, and then security. And so we need to always find compromises between those and make a risk-based management.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'd like to shift the topic just a little bit and talk about something that Jason hit on, which is basic cyber hygiene. And I'd like to connect that to configuration. And I want to talk about the initial default settings as far as configuration go, as well as automating that configuration aspect. So we just spent time talking about automating the advisory consumption, automating updates, automating patches. How do you see the future of managing configuration, whether it be changing the defaults or changing automation in that space? And this time, I'm going to start with Omar on your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Automation is something that is not the future. We need to actually think about it now. And in many cases, and your question, added two things. One is how we're going to see the products of the future being able to provide the capabilities in place to fully automate, these things. I'm going to table that for now. But even if you look at how technology has evolved throughout the last, 15 years or so, there was a human interacting with, talking with network infrastructure devices, router, switch, firewall, etc. And then that human had to have some type of level of experience, like a CCIE, able to configure BGP, right? Then we started integrating automation, right? And that automation has been, unfortunately, very vendor-oriented, right? And Derek can attest probably to that. Of course, Cisco has their own solution. They sell their own, Juniper has their own, and so on. So fast forward many years, now there's a lot of efforts for, lack of a better word, harmonizing, the technical aspects of technology. So what are the telemetry capabilities that we have in place that if I am building automation, I don't have to worry about the Cisco approach or the Juniper approach or the Vendor X approach, that we can actually do that collectively and create the tools that will fuel the present and the future. The second one is that, yes, depending on who you talk to, you're going to get 50 answers. This is going to be cloud-driven, not cloud-driven, SDN versus the other technologies and so on. But the true common denominator here is that even if automation is taking place in some areas, unfortunately, the larger organizations, they're a little bit more capable of doing that. It is a one, point in time scenario. I automate my deployment of these technologies. I make sure that these configurations are correct, that are by default, quote unquote, secure, and then I move on. And there's no automation to actually see if there was not a ticket that somebody actually changed the configuration, that now it potentially is a threat actor, manipulating the system, and so on. So my automation has to assist not only from the beginning of the configuration, is the whole life cycle, right? And then the last one, and I'll pass it to Derek. It is very near to my heart. Allan actually mentioned it. Of course, I cannot contain myself to mention it. Is even determining what is end of life or end support in any product, whether it's an open source product, a Cisco product, Juniper, a router, and so on. There's no consistent way in the industry to do that programmatically, right? So that's what we actually started. Many of us represented here are participating in different initiatives for the taxonomy of what is end of support and so on, and what are the capabilities from an automated standpoint, standards that we can actually use to then develop the tools to help identify end of life and end of support and the whole life cycle. Again, not the original configuration, but after the device needs to be replaced. So thank you.
Yeah, and definitely a shout out, as we made in the Network Resilience Coalition white paper, to the OASIS Open EOX effort, which is what Omar is referencing there, which is an open standards effort to attempt to better in a machine readable way, express some of this end of support, end of life timing information. So definitely check that out. Derek?
Yeah. As great as the efforts to educate the end user are, I think that we, the providers, either of the products or the services, can be doing more to make it harder for them to shoot themselves in the foot. And in order for that to happen, security needs to be more universal in our companies. I mean, even today, we have a great PSERT. We're great at writing security advisories. We have a secure development lifecycle team that comes in and helps you do things securely. There's a security architect on projects, and yet when a user gets our device, it comes with a default password, and we don't force you to change it before you can use it. There are things that we could build into our products that make it harder for them to be idiots and insecure, and we don't do them. We don't do them because they're hard, because they're expensive, because they're complicated, or whatever. So I think that there's the communication piece is great, but we still don't value security enough, or it's not as profitable enough to make it sort of a core piece of everything that we build. And we're trying to get better about that. And we do have products that force you to change the password as soon as you turn it on and things like that. But that's a mindset that the security folks have had for a very long time, that's only now still sort of percolating in, throughout the entire company. And I think things like SBOM, are going to shine flashlights on this, and are hopefully going to make organizations realize that this is important. And having Shodan show their 50,000 devices with a default password still on the internet is something that we can actually start to combat and fix.
And Christian?
Yeah, just to add to Derek's point, so there's something even worse than default passwords. Default passwords you can't change. So the guy in my team who leads on the effort on getting the devices without default passwords, he recently got an oven from a provider for his personal kitchen, and it comes with an admin password that is admin hard-coded. And you cannot change it. And this is just the worst of all. So not even an opportunity to change it. It's just hard-coded and must stay like this. So we need to absolutely get away from this. So one thing I want to add a little bit that is different from what was mentioned on the panel so far is that we also need to enlighten and give more insights to our customers. So, I mean, we need to make life easy. And as Allan mentioned earlier, secure by default is really what we want to do. Secure by design and secure by default. But on the other hand, we also want to give our customers means to see what is happening on the network in their small office or in their home office or at home, for example. And so we want to see them, the devices that they have, the connectivity. And we give them also a kind of an indication what the rating, risk rating we see on the devices, on the connection, stuff like this, so that they can make a self-determined judgment on whether they cut off some devices from internet access, whether they should put more parental control on their kids' devices, stuff like this. So we have given them quite a bit of insights and tooling in order to make them educated, insightful, and empower them.
Okay. Yeah, it's really good points there raised in terms of the challenges, but also the necessity of this. Okay, so as we get towards the end of our panel here and the end of the webinar, I want to kind of tie us back into our two government guest speakers and ask the panel if, in just a couple sentences to keep it short, what do you see as the ideal relationship between the industry and world governments, particularly when we're dealing with these nation state level threats? Do you think the level of cooperation is already perfect? Are you looking for more, for less? In a couple sentences, talk about it. And this time I'm going to start with Derek just to bring it full circle.
I will say that it's good and it's getting better. One of the things that I absolutely love about my job and this industry, and Omar has alluded to it, my best friends in the job that I do are the PCERT folks at Cisco. And even before I was at Juniper, Cisco was, I came to learn about Juniper when I was at a different company because Cisco was introducing them to the community. And we were the ones, Juniper introduced Palo Alto to the community. There's very much an understanding that our customers are running all of our equipment and nobody wins when there's a security issue. And if Cisco has one today and Juniper has one tomorrow, all that's happened is a customer's been hit twice. But if we work together and prevent that from happening, everybody wins. And I think industry has figured that out for a long time. I've been doing this for more than 2 decades. I've known Omar for more than 2 decades. I think we're starting to figure it out, and we've had some great conversations with CISA and others. This is going to be public anyway, so I can say it. The NSA reported a vulnerability to us recently, and that's great. I'm happy they're finding things. Of course, we're going to fix it. I rather jokingly said, normally when someone reports something to us, we acknowledge and thank them in our advisory, and I assume you don't want that. And they said, no, it'd be great. So in the not too distant future, we're going to be publishing an advisory where we thank the NSA for reporting this to us. That wouldn't have happened a decade ago. So I think that's wonderful. I think it's good, and I think it's getting better.
Great. It's good to hear. Omar.
No, thank you. I think that Derek summarized it very, very well. If you look at even 5 years ago, right, whenever we had panels like this and we had similar questions, say, how can we do better integration between the public and private sector? We always said, we should work together to identify, prevent, and respond to any threat, right? Whether it's nation state threats and so on. Fast forward now is way, way, way better. You see all the different guidance that are now being put in place. Even though there's a lot of government logos in there, there's also a lot of collaboration behind the scenes with private sector, right? The mechanisms will never be perfect, right? So we're not gonna, say, hey, we're gonna have a 5-year plan for a perfect thing. We have to just evolve it. This landscape is continuous to evolve, so we have to continue to have clear communication channels, common goals in place, and especially what Derek also mentioned about awareness, right? That we definitely have to work together on that and to make sure that we evolve our programs. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Omar. And Chris, if you could slip in a couple sentences. Sorry, I've kind of let you down to the end of the clock here.
No, Derek said it brilliantly. It's getting better. I mean, with NCSC in particular. And what I really appreciate is that we're starting to come together and stop segmenting information and really strong need to know rather openly, hey, this is what's happening in the world, talking about live incidents as well as they happen, just so that people are really part into this live action game that is threat intelligence and defense that we are fighting on a daily basis. So this is really good. And thank you for having us. It was really great being here. Thank you.
Of course. And thank you to all the panelists. I think that was a great session. A lot of really good conversation. Love seeing the progress that we're making, even from just the discussions we had on panels last year. So thank you so much to our panelists. And thank you again to Jason and Allan for your participation. We really appreciated having you here. And thank you to all of our attendees. We're going to go ahead and wrap up this session. We were recording and we will have this recording up as soon as we can. So thank you again to everybody. Have a great rest of your day. And we will reach out with the recording and summaries.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.